I walked out of a boardroom worth $43 million the moment my phone buzzed with those three words. Emergency C-section today. The drive across 2 states felt like falling through dark water, every mile pulling me towards something I couldn't name but already feared. When I finally reached the hospital corridor where my daughter lay recovering, her husband stood in front of the door like a sentinel, his jaw set, his eyes cold, and said the words that would fracture everything I thought I understood about my family. 3 days later, when the surgeon's voice came through my phone asking about a missing payment authorization under my name, I realized the door Jeffrey had closed wasn't just about visiting hours. I was 70 years old the day I learned that loyalty has a price tag, and sometimes the people you love most will slap that tag right across your chest without asking permission. The conference room smelled like leather and desperation. 12 men in tailored suits watching me like I held the answer to a question they hadn't yet figured out how to ask. $43 million sat on the table between us, not literally, but in contracts and projections and promises that would reshape my company's next decade. I had spent 9 months building toward this moment. My phone buzzed against my thigh. I ignored it. The lead investor, a man named Carmichael with silver temples and shark eyes, leaned forward and asked me to clarify our third-quarter projections for the overseas market. I opened my mouth to respond. My phone buzzed again, then again. I excused myself with a smile that felt like broken glass. The hallway outside was empty and too bright. I pulled out my phone and saw 3 texts from a number I didn't recognize, each one a fragment. Emma, hospital, emergency C-section. My daughter's name on a stranger's screen, clinical and cold. My heart became a fist. I called the number. A nurse answered, her voice professionally gentle, and explained that Emma had developed complications, preeclampsia. They'd taken the baby early. Both were stable now, but it had been touch and go for a while. I asked if Emma was asking for me. There was a pause, just half a second too long, and the nurse said Emma was resting, family was with her. I should come when I could. I didn't go back into the conference room. I texted my associate, a younger man named David who'd worked beside me for 8 years, told him to handle it, apologize, reschedule if possible. He called immediately. I didn't answer. I was already in the elevator descending, my reflection in the steel doors showing me a man I barely recognized, pale and tight-jawed and suddenly ancient. The drive from Boston to the hospital in Albany took 4 hours, but felt like falling down a well with no bottom. I'd driven this route a dozen times to visit Emma and Jeffrey, always with a sense of anticipation, always eager to see my daughter's life unfolding. This time the highway stretched like a threat. I thought about my wife, Margaret, who'd died 5 years ago from an aneurysm that gave no warning and took no prisoners. I thought about how Emma had held my hand at the funeral and promised we'd be okay, just the 2 of us. We'd make it work. I thought about the last time I'd seen her, 3 months ago when she and Jeffrey had come to Boston for a weekend. She'd looked tired. I'd asked if everything was all right. She'd smiled and said pregnancy was harder than she'd expected. But she was happy, really happy. Jeffrey had nodded beside her, his hand on her knee, possessive and certain. I'd believed them both. Maybe I'd wanted to believe them. Maybe that was my first mistake. I reached the hospital as the sun dropped below the horizon, turning the sky into a bruise. The parking garage was a concrete maze. I found a spot near the elevator and sat in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to collect myself. I was Frank Holloway, a man who'd built a logistics company from nothing, who'd negotiated with unions and investors and bureaucrats, who'd survived my wife's death and kept moving forward because that's what you did. But walking into that hospital, I felt like a child, small and uncertain, afraid of what I might find behind those sterile doors. I went inside. The lobby was too warm and smelled like antiseptic and cafeteria coffee. A volunteer at the information desk, an elderly woman with kind eyes, directed me to the maternity ward on the 4th floor. I took the elevator. A young couple stood beside me, the woman's belly enormous, the man's face bright with nervous excitement. I remembered being that man 34 years ago, pacing in a waiting room while Margaret labored for 18 hours to bring Emma into the world. I remembered holding Emma for the first time, her face red and furious, her tiny fist wrapped around my finger. I remembered thinking I would do anything for this person, anything at all. The maternity ward was painted in soft colors, blues and greens meant to soothe but instead felt surreal. I approached the nurse's station and gave Emma's name. The nurse, a woman in her 40s with weary eyes, checked her computer and told me the room number. I walked down the corridor, passing other rooms where families gathered, where balloons floated and flowers crowded windowsills. Emma's room was at the end, the door half closed. I raised my hand to knock. Before my knuckles touched wood, the door opened from inside. Jeffrey stood there. My son-in-law was 36, tall and fit, with the kind of clean-cut handsomeness that photographed well. He worked in tech, something involving startups and venture capital, the details of which he'd explained to me multiple times but never quite landed. He looked at me now with an expression I couldn't read, something between surprise and irritation. I smiled, tried to, and said I'd come as soon as I heard, asked how Emma was, how the baby was. Jeffrey stepped into the hallway and pulled the door shut behind him. He didn't invite me in. He stood with his back to the door, his arms crossed, and said Emma was resting. The baby was in the NICU for observation. Everything was under control. I nodded, said I understood, asked if I could see her, just for a moment. I wouldn't stay long. Jeffrey's jaw tightened. He glanced down the hallway, then back at me and said, Emma only wanted her side of the family there right now. It was her decision. He was just respecting her wishes. The words hit me like a slap. I stood there trying to process what he'd just said, trying to make sense of it. Her side of the family. Margaret was dead. Margaret's parents were dead. Margaret's sister lived in Oregon and they barely spoke. I was Emma's family. I was the only family she had left. I asked Jeffrey what he meant. He repeated himself slower, like I was hard of hearing, said Emma needed space, needed her mom's family, needed to feel supported by people who understood her. I pointed out that Margaret was gone. Jeffrey said her aunt was here, her cousins, people Emma felt close to. I'd met Margaret's sister twice. Emma had never mentioned feeling close to her. I should have pushed harder. I should have demanded to see my daughter, should have raised my voice, should have made a scene. Instead, I stood there, a 70-year-old man in a hospital corridor, feeling the weight of my age and my confusion, and I nodded. I told Jeffrey to tell Emma I loved her, that I was thinking of her, that I'd call tomorrow. He said he'd pass along the message. He went back into the room and closed the door. I stood there for another moment, staring at the wood grain, listening to the muffled sounds of hospital life around me. Then I turned and walked back down the corridor, past the nurse's station, past the young couple now sitting in the waiting area, past the volunteer at the information desk who smiled and wished me a good evening. I drove home in the dark, my hands shaking on the wheel, my mind spinning through every interaction I'd had with Emma over the past year, searching for the moment when I'd lost her. I reached my house after midnight. The place felt enormous and empty, the kind of empty that settles into your bones. I'd lived here with Margaret for 30 years, raised Emma here, filled these rooms with laughter and arguments and the ordinary chaos of family life. After Margaret died, Emma had urged me to sell, to downsize, to move into something more manageable. I'd refused. This was my home. These walls held memories I wasn't ready to abandon. Now walking through the dark rooms, I wondered if I'd been holding on to ghosts while the living slipped away. I sat in the kitchen and tried calling Emma's cell. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. What would I say? I tried texting instead. Kept it simple. Told her I'd been at the hospital, that Jeffrey said she needed space, that I respected that, but wanted her to know I was here whenever she was ready. I watched the screen for a response. Nothing. I sat there until the sky began to lighten, until exhaustion dragged me upstairs to bed, where I lay on top of the covers and stared at the ceiling and tried not to think about the door Jeffrey had closed between us. The next day I called the hospital and asked to be connected to Emma's room. The call rang through, but no one answered. I tried again an hour later. Same result. I considered driving back to Albany, but the memory of Jeffrey's face, that cold certainty, stopped me. I didn't want to make things worse. I didn't want to be the overbearing father who couldn't take a hint, but the silence gnawed at me. I kept checking my phone, kept expecting a text or a call, some acknowledgement that I existed. Nothing came. I tried to distract myself with work, with emails and conference calls and the fallout from the abandoned meeting. Carmichael's people were furious. David had managed to keep the deal alive barely, but they wanted assurances, wanted me back at the table within the week. I told David to handle it. He asked if I was okay. I said I was fine. He didn't believe me. Neither did I. The third day after the hospital, I was sitting in my study, staring at a contract I'd read 3 times without absorbing a single word, when my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered, expecting a telemarketer. Instead, a man's voice, calm and professional, introduced himself as Dr. Michael Reeves, the surgeon who'd performed Emma's C-section. My heart kicked. I asked if Emma was all right, if there were complications. Dr. Reeves assured me both Emma and the baby were doing well, recovering as expected. Then he paused, and in that pause I heard the real reason for his call. He said there was an issue with the billing, that the hospital's finance department had reached out to him because there was a discrepancy in the payment authorization. He said my name was listed as the guarantor for the procedure, but the signed authorization form was missing from the file, and the insurance information provided wasn't processing correctly. He wanted to confirm that I'd agreed to cover the costs. I sat very still. I asked Dr. Reeves to repeat what he'd just said. He did patiently, and added that it wasn't unusual for family members to help with medical expenses, but the hospital needed proper documentation, and since the bill was substantial, over $60,000 with the NICU stay and complications, they wanted to make sure everything was in order before proceeding. I told him I hadn't signed anything. I told him I didn't know anything about being listed as a guarantor. Dr. Reeves went quiet. Then he said he'd check with the admissions office, that perhaps there'd been a miscommunication and he'd get back to me. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I sat there, the phone in my hand, feeling something cold and sharp unfold in my chest. I called the hospital's billing department directly. A woman named Susan answered, cheerful and efficient, and I explained the situation. She pulled up Emma's file and confirmed that yes, my name was listed as the financial guarantor, and yes, the insurance had denied the claim due to some issue with Jeffrey's policy, and yes, the hospital would be reaching out to me for payment unless the matter was resolved. I asked who had provided my information. Susan checked and said it had been submitted during the admission process, signed by Jeffrey Marsh as the patient's spouse and primary contact. I felt my jaw tighten. I asked Susan to email me a copy of the forms. She said she'd have to get authorization. I told her I was the person being held financially responsible. I had a right to see the documents. She hesitated, then agreed, said she'd send them within the hour. The email arrived 40 minutes later. I opened the attachments, 3 scanned forms, and saw my name typed into fields I'd never filled. My address listed, my phone number, even a forged signature that looked nothing like mine, but apparently no one had bothered to verify. Jeffrey had listed me as guarantor without asking, without telling me, and had done it with enough confidence that the hospital had accepted it without question. I printed the forms and spread them across my desk, staring at the evidence of something I still couldn't fully name. Was it fraud? Was it desperation? Was it simple arrogance? The assumption that of course I'd pay, of course I'd cover whatever costs they incurred because that's what fathers did? I picked up my phone and almost called Jeffrey. Then I stopped. If I called now, angry and accusatory, he'd have time to prepare, to spin a story, to position himself as the victim of some misunderstanding. I needed information first. I needed to understand what was really happening. I called Emma's best friend, Claire, a woman she'd known since college, someone who'd been in their wedding, someone Emma trusted. Claire answered on the second ring, her voice warm with recognition. I asked how she was, made small talk for a moment, then carefully, casually asked if she'd been to visit Emma at the hospital. Claire's tone shifted. She said she'd tried, that she'd driven up the day after the baby was born, but Jeffrey had told her Emma wasn't up for visitors yet, that she needed rest. Claire had left flowers at the nurse's station and gone home. She sounded hurt. I asked if she'd heard from Emma since. Claire said no, that Emma's phone seemed to be off or she wasn't answering, and Claire was starting to worry but didn't want to be pushy. I asked if Emma had seemed okay before the birth, if Claire had noticed anything unusual. Claire hesitated. Then she said Emma had seemed stressed, that the last time they'd talked, maybe 2 weeks before the delivery, Emma had mentioned money being tight, something about Jeffrey's business not doing as well as expected. I felt something click into place. After I hung up with Claire, I sat in the growing darkness of my study and pieced together a picture I didn't want to see. Jeffrey's startup had failed. I didn't know this for certain yet, but the shape of it was there in the missing insurance, in the forged guarantor forms, in the way he'd blocked me from seeing Emma. A man who was desperate, who was drowning, who needed money, and saw his father-in-law as a solution rather than a person. I thought about the last time Jeffrey and I had spoken alone, maybe 6 months ago, when he'd asked me about investment opportunities, about whether I'd ever considered backing tech ventures. I told him I was too old to gamble on startups, that I preferred stable returns. He'd laughed it off, said he was just curious. Now I wondered if that had been his first attempt to tap into my resources, and when I'd declined, he'd found another way. I spent the next day making calls, quiet and methodical, the way I'd learned to operate in business when you needed information without tipping your hand. I called the hospital's billing department again, spoke to a supervisor, explained the situation with the forged signature, and asked them to flag the account, to not process any charges to my name until the matter was legally resolved. The supervisor was sympathetic, said they'd put a hold on collections, but I'd need to file a formal dispute. I said I would. I called my attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia, who'd handled my business contracts for 20 years, and asked her to look into the legality of what Jeffrey had done. She said it was identity fraud if he'd forged my signature, that I could press charges if I wanted. I told her I wasn't sure what I wanted yet. I just needed to know my options. She said she'd prepare documentation. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I hired a private investigator. His name was Dennis, a former cop turned freelancer, someone I'd used once before to vet a potential business partner who'd had a resume that didn't quite add up. I told Dennis I needed background on Jeffrey Marsh, particularly his financial situation, his business dealings, anything that might explain why he was acting erratically. Dennis said he'd have preliminary information within 48 hours. I paid his retainer and waited. Waiting has never been my strength. I've built a career on action, on making decisions, and moving forward. But this required patience. This required letting the truth surface on its own timeline. On the 4th day after the hospital, Emma finally called me. Her voice was thin and tired, and she said she was sorry she hadn't reached out sooner, that everything had been overwhelming, that the baby, a boy they'd named Lucas, was still in the NICU but improving. I told her I was glad to hear it, that I'd been worried, that I'd tried to visit, but Jeffrey said she needed space. There was a pause. Emma said she didn't know what I was talking about. She said Jeffrey hadn't mentioned I'd been at the hospital. I felt my hand tighten on the phone. I asked her directly, carefully, if she'd told Jeffrey she didn't want to see me, that she only wanted her mother's side of the family there. Emma's voice changed, became sharper. She said no, absolutely not, that she'd been asking where I was, why I hadn't come, and Jeffrey kept saying I was busy with work, that I'd visit when I could. The lie sat between us like a living thing. I could hear Emma's breathing, quick and shallow, and beneath it the sound of hospital machinery, beeping and humming. I told her the truth, told her I'd driven 4 hours the day she gave birth, that Jeffrey had blocked me at the door, that I'd been trying to reach her ever since. Emma started crying, not soft tears but deep, wrenching sobs that made me ache across the distance between us. She said she didn't understand. She didn't know why Jeffrey would do that he'd been acting strange lately, but she thought it was just stress from the pregnancy. I asked if we could talk in person, if I could come see her now. She said yes, please, that she needed to see me, needed to understand what was happening. I told her I'd be there in a few hours. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. The drive to Albany felt different this time, purposeful instead of desperate, though my heart still hammered against my ribs. I arrived at the hospital in the early evening, the sky that same bruised purple it had been 4 days ago, and I wondered if this was my chance to rewrite the ending. The maternity ward was quieter now, fewer families, fewer balloons. I found Emma's room and knocked softly. She called for me to come in. When I opened the door, I saw my daughter propped up in bed, pale and exhausted, her hair pulled back, her eyes red from crying. She looked so much like Margaret in that moment it stole my breath. I crossed the room and took her hand. She gripped my fingers hard and said she was sorry, said she didn't know, said everything was so confused. I told her we'd figure it out together. Jeffrey wasn't there. Emma said he'd gone home to shower and change, that he'd been at the hospital almost constantly since the birth. I asked if we could talk about what happened, about why he'd lied to both of us. Emma's face crumpled. She said she'd been thinking about it all afternoon, that things had been off for months, that Jeffrey had been secretive about money, had been snapping at her when she asked questions, had insisted on handling all the bills and the insurance himself. She said she'd trusted him because that's what you did when you were married, you trusted your partner. Now she felt stupid. I told her she wasn't stupid, that trust wasn't stupidity, that Jeffrey had manipulated the situation. Then I told her about the hospital bill, about my name being listed as guarantor without my knowledge, about the forged signature. Emma's face went white. She said she didn't know about that Jeffrey had told her their insurance was covering everything, that there was nothing to worry about. I showed her the forms on my phone, the scanned documents Susan had sent. Emma stared at the screen, her hand shaking, and said this wasn't possible, that Jeffrey wouldn't do something like this. But even as she said it, I could see the doubt in her eyes, the pieces falling into place. She asked what else I knew. I told her about Claire being turned away, about the calls that went unanswered, about my conversation with Dr. Reeves. Emma closed her eyes and leaned back against the pillows. She said she wanted to talk to Jeffrey, wanted to hear his explanation. I said that was fair, but I wanted to be there when she did. She nodded. We sat together in the dimming room, not talking, just being present, and I felt some of the fracture between us begin to knit back together. Emma asked if she could see the baby with me if I wanted to meet Lucas. I said I'd been waiting for that invitation since the moment I heard he existed. We walked down the hallway to the NICU, Emma moving slowly, still recovering, and a nurse led us through the security doors into a room filled with tiny beds and machines. Lucas was in an incubator near the back, a small red-faced creature with a shock of dark hair and eyes that were closed in sleep. Emma reached through the porthole and touched his hand with one finger. I stood beside her and looked at my grandson, this new person who carried forward the chain of life that had started long before me and would continue long after. And I felt the weight of responsibility settle over me again, heavier and more certain than before. Jeffrey arrived an hour later. I was still in Emma's room, sitting in the chair beside her bed, when he walked through the door carrying a duffel bag and a coffee. He stopped when he saw me, his expression shifting from surprise to something darker. He asked what I was doing there. Emma, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, said she'd invited me, that we needed to talk, all three of us. Jeffrey set down the bag and the coffee very carefully. He said this wasn't a good time, that Emma needed rest. Emma said she'd had enough rest, that what she needed now was the truth. She asked Jeffrey why he'd told me she didn't want to see me. Jeffrey glanced at me, then back at Emma, and said there'd been a miscommunication, that he'd thought Emma wanted space from everyone, that he'd been trying to protect her. Emma asked him why he'd told her I was too busy to visit. Jeffrey said he didn't remember saying that. Emma's voice went hard. She said he was lying. The room felt too small suddenly, the air thick with things that couldn't be unsaid. Jeffrey ran a hand through his hair and said he'd been under a lot of stress, that maybe he'd gotten confused, that it wasn't intentional. I spoke then, my voice quiet but firm, and asked Jeffrey why he'd listed me as the financial guarantor for the C-section without asking my permission. Jeffrey went very still. He said he didn't know what I was talking about. I pulled out my phone and showed him the forms, the same ones I'd shown Emma. Jeffrey looked at the screen and his face flushed. He said there must have been a mistake, that the hospital must have mixed up paperwork. I told him the signature was dated the day of Emma's admission, that he'd been the one who submitted it. Jeffrey said he'd been panicking, that Emma was in danger, that he'd done what he thought was necessary. I asked why he hadn't called me, why he hadn't asked. Jeffrey's jaw clenched. He said he didn't think he needed permission to protect his wife. Emma interrupted, her voice shaking. She asked Jeffrey about the insurance, about why it wasn't covering the costs. Jeffrey turned to her and said the policy had lapsed, that there'd been an issue with the payments, that he was working on fixing it. Emma asked why he hadn't told her. Jeffrey said he didn't want to worry her while she was pregnant. Emma asked how long the insurance had been lapsed. Jeffrey didn't answer. Emma's voice rose. She asked how long. Jeffrey said 3 months. Emma stared at him like he was a stranger. She asked what happened to the money they'd been paying for insurance. Jeffrey said his business had some setbacks, that he'd had to make choices, that he'd thought he could fix it before it became a problem. Emma asked if he'd gambled on her health, on their baby's health, to keep his company afloat. Jeffrey said it wasn't like that. Emma said it was exactly like that. The argument escalated, voices rising, years of unspoken tension spilling out into the sterile hospital room. I sat there watching my daughter confront her husband, watching the facade crack and crumble. And I realized this wasn't just about the hospital bill or the blocked visit. This was about control, about Jeffrey's inability to admit failure, about the way he'd tried to manage the narrative from both sides, keeping Emma and me separated so we couldn't compare notes, couldn't see the full picture. He'd underestimated both of us. Emma told Jeffrey to leave. He said they needed to talk this through. Emma said she couldn't look at him right now, that she needed time. Jeffrey looked at me, his eyes full of something between rage and desperation, and said this was my fault, that I'd turned Emma against him. I told him the only person responsible for this situation was him. He grabbed the duffel bag and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Emma broke down then, sobbing into her hands, and I moved to the bed and held her the way I'd held her when she was small, when the world felt too big and scary and only a father's arms could make it safe. I told her it would be okay, that we'd figure this out, that she and Lucas were the priorities now. She asked what she was supposed to do, how she was supposed to trust Jeffrey again. I said I didn't have that answer, that she'd have to decide what kind of marriage she could live with, but that whatever she chose, I'd support her. She asked about the hospital bill. I said I'd take care of it, that she shouldn't worry about money, that her only job was to heal and take care of her son. She pulled back and looked at me, her eyes red and fierce, and said she didn't want me to pay for Jeffrey's mistakes. I told her it wasn't about Jeffrey, it was about her and Lucas, and I wasn't going to let financial stress add to what she was already carrying. The next week was a blur of legal paperwork and tense phone calls. Dennis, the investigator, came back with a report that confirmed what I'd suspected. Jeffrey's startup had burned through its venture capital 6 months ago and officially dissolved 3 months later. He'd been living on credit cards and borrowing from friends, trying to keep up appearances while everything collapsed around him. The insurance had lapsed because he couldn't afford the premiums. He'd listed me as guarantor because he knew the hospital wouldn't turn away a patient in an emergency, and he'd gambled that I'd cover the costs rather than let Emma suffer the consequences. It was calculated and desperate in equal measure. Patricia, my attorney, filed a formal dispute with the hospital, provided evidence of the forged signature, and negotiated a payment plan that would come from Jeffrey's assets rather than mine. It meant he'd likely have to declare bankruptcy, but that wasn't my problem to solve. Emma stayed in the hospital for 6 days total. When she was discharged, Lucas came home with her, tiny and fragile, but healthy. Emma called and asked if she and the baby could stay with me for a while, that she couldn't go back to the house she shared with Jeffrey. Not yet, maybe not ever. I told her my home was her home, that she could stay as long as she needed. She arrived on a gray afternoon, Claire driving her because Emma wasn't ready to be behind the wheel yet, and I helped carry Lucas in his car seat through the door. The house felt different with them there, smaller and warmer, filled with the sounds of a baby crying and Emma's soft voice soothing him. I set up the nursery and what had been Emma's childhood bedroom, the room Margaret and I had painted yellow when we found out we were having a daughter. And watching Emma rock Lucas in the same corner where I'd once rocked her felt like time folding in on itself. Jeffrey tried calling repeatedly. Emma didn't answer. He showed up at the house one evening, standing on the porch asking to talk. Emma spoke to him through the screen door, told him she needed space, that she was considering divorce, that he needed to respect her boundaries. Jeffrey argued, said they could work through this, that he'd made mistakes but he loved her. Emma said love wasn't enough when trust was gone. Jeffrey looked past her to where I stood in the hallway, and for a moment I saw something like hatred in his eyes. He said I'd poisoned Emma against him. Emma told him that was exactly the kind of deflection that made her certain she was making the right choice. Jeffrey left. Emma closed the door and leaned against it, her whole body shaking. I asked if she was okay. She said no, but she would be. The divorce proceedings started a month later. Patricia recommended a family law specialist, a woman named Karen, who was known for being tough but fair. Emma met with her, laid out the situation, provided documentation of Jeffrey's financial fraud and manipulation. Karen said it was a strong case, that Emma would likely get primary custody of Lucas, that Jeffrey would be required to pay child support once he had income again, though given his current bankruptcy that might take time. Emma said she didn't care about the money, she just wanted to protect her son. Karen said that was the right priority. The legal process was slow and grinding, full of paperwork and court dates and mediation sessions that left Emma exhausted. I went with her when I could, sat in waiting rooms, held Lucas while Emma met with attorneys. Jeffrey fought the divorce at first, contested the terms, tried to paint Emma as unstable, tried to use my involvement as evidence that she was being manipulated. It didn't work. The evidence was too clear, the pattern too obvious. 6 months after Lucas was born, the divorce was finalized. Emma was granted full custody. Jeffrey was given supervised visitation rights once he could prove financial stability, and the house they'd shared was sold to pay off debts. Emma cried the day the papers were signed, not for Jeffrey, she said, but for the life she thought she was building, for the future that had turned out to be built on sand. I told her grief was allowed, that mourning what could have been didn't mean she'd made the wrong choice. She nodded and held Lucas close, and I saw in her face the same strength Margaret had carried, the ability to endure pain and come out the other side still standing. Lucas grew. 6 months became a year, became 18 months. Emma found work as a graphic designer, something she could do from home, something flexible enough to accommodate the chaos of single parenthood. She was tired most of the time, stretched thin, but there was a lightness in her now that had been missing before, a sense of freedom. We fell into a rhythm, the three of us in the big house, dinners together, bedtime routines, weekend trips to the park. I taught Lucas to stack blocks, to clap his hands, to say Papa before he said anything else. Emma laughed when he did, said I was spoiling him. I said that was a grandfather's job. Jeffrey saw Lucas occasionally, supervised visits in a neutral location, but he remained distant, still caught up in his own failures, unable to be the father Lucas needed. Emma said she'd stopped hoping he'd change. She said acceptance was its own kind of peace. One evening, nearly 2 years after that night in the hospital, Emma and I sat on the back porch while Lucas slept inside, the baby monitor crackling softly between us. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Emma said she wanted to thank me. I asked what for. She said for not giving up, for driving across the state when I'd heard she was in trouble, for pushing through when Jeffrey tried to keep us apart, for taking care of her and Lucas when everything fell apart. She said she didn't know what she would have done without me. I told her she would have survived, that she was stronger than she knew, but I was grateful I'd been there to help carry the weight. She leaned her head on my shoulder, the way she used to when she was small, and said she understood now what Margaret used to say, that family wasn't just about blood or obligation, it was about showing up, about choosing to stay even when things got hard. I told her Margaret would be proud of her. Emma said she hoped so. I thought about that closed door at the hospital, about Jeffrey standing there like a wall between me and my daughter, and how close I'd come to accepting that rejection, to believing Emma truly didn't want me there. I thought about the phone call from Dr. Reeves about how a single detail, a missing payment authorization, had unraveled Jeffrey's carefully constructed lies. I thought about the choices we make in moments of crisis, about the difference between controlling a situation and trusting the people you love to handle the truth. I'd spent my life building things, companies and contracts and careful plans. But the most important thing I'd ever built was the relationship with my daughter, and I'd almost lost it because I hadn't fought hard enough, hadn't questioned the narrative I was being fed. I wouldn't make that mistake again. Lucas woke up crying and Emma went inside to get him. She came back out carrying the sleepy toddler, his face flushed and confused. She handed him to me, and he curled against my chest, his small body warm and trusting. I held my grandson and looked out at the darkening yard, at the swing set I'd installed last month, at the garden Emma had planted, at the evidence of life continuing and adapting and growing despite everything. Margaret's absence was still a weight I carried, but it was a gentler weight now, softened by time and by the knowledge that the love we'd built together had created this, had created Emma, who'd created Lucas, and the chain went on, stronger for having been tested. I pressed my lips to Lucas's hair and breathed in the scent of him, baby shampoo and milk, and something indefinable that was purely his own. Emma sat beside me again and said she'd been thinking about what happened, about Jeffrey and the lies and the way everything had unraveled. She said she'd realized something important. She said sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you need protection from. And sometimes the only way to survive is to recognize that truth and act on it, even when it means dismantling your entire life. She said she was grateful for the strength to do that, grateful that I'd given her a safe place to land. I told her she'd always have that this house, this family, this space was hers as long as she needed it. She smiled, tired but real, and said she knew. We sat there as the stars came out, the three of us, and I felt something settle in my chest, a sense of rightness, of having made it through the fire and found something worth keeping on the other side. The hospital bill was paid off eventually, split between insurance adjustments, legal settlements, and my own contribution, which I made willingly despite the principle of the thing. Money was just money, useful only insofar as it solved problems or created security. And I'd spent my life accumulating enough of it that this particular problem could be solved without breaking me. What mattered was Emma's peace of mind, was Lucas's future, was the knowledge that we'd faced something ugly and survived it together. Patricia closed the case. Dennis moved on to other investigations. Dr. Reeves sent a kind note thanking me for resolving the billing issue and wishing Emma and Lucas well. Life moved forward because that's what life does, regardless of whether you're ready for it. I still think about that moment at the hospital door sometimes, about the choice I made to walk away instead of pushing through. And I wonder what would have happened if I'd been more forceful, more demanding, more willing to cause a scene. Would I have discovered Jeffrey's lies sooner? Would Emma have been spared some of the pain? Or would it have made things worse, driven a wedge between us that couldn't be mended? I don't have answers. I only have the outcome, which is Emma and Lucas here with me, safe and healing, and the knowledge that when the next crisis comes, because there's always a next crisis, I'll be better prepared to fight for what matters. On Lucas's second birthday, we threw a small party in the backyard, just family and a few close friends. Claire came, and some of Emma's co-workers, and the neighbors with their kids. Lucas wore a ridiculous hat and smashed cake into his face and laughed with pure, unfiltered joy. Emma took photos, dozens of them, and sent one to Jeffrey with a brief message saying Lucas was healthy and happy. Jeffrey didn't respond, but I saw Emma check her phone throughout the afternoon, saw the flicker of hope and disappointment. I pulled her aside and told her she'd done the right thing, that keeping the door open for Lucas's sake was generous, but she couldn't control whether Jeffrey walked through it. She nodded and put the phone away. That evening, after everyone had gone home and Lucas was asleep, Emma found me in the study where I was pretending to review contracts but really just sitting in the quiet. She came in and sat across from me and said she'd made a decision. She said she wanted to move out to find a place of her own to stand on her own feet. She said living with me had been a lifeline when she needed it, but she was ready now, ready to build something new. I felt a pang of loss, but also pride. And I told her I understood that I'd help her find a place, that I'd always be here when she needed me. She said she knew, and that was why she could leave, because she knew I wasn't going anywhere. We talked logistics, timelines, budgets. Emma wanted to stay nearby, wanted Lucas to see me often, wanted to maintain the family connection we'd rebuilt. I told her that sounded perfect. A month later, Emma and Lucas moved into a small house 3 miles away, a 2-bedroom with a yard and good light and enough space for them to grow. I helped with the move, carried boxes and assembled furniture and hung pictures. Emma decorated with care, creating a home that was entirely hers, full of color and warmth and the kind of intentional joy that comes from surviving something hard and choosing to thrive anyway. The first night in the new house, she invited me for dinner. We ate pasta at her small kitchen table while Lucas threw noodles on the floor, and Emma raised her glass of wine and said, "Here's to new beginnings." I raised my water and echoed her words, and we clinked glasses, and I felt Margaret's presence in the room. Not as a ghost, but as a foundation, the bedrock on which all of this had been built. Jeffrey remarried eventually, to someone none of us knew, and moved to another state for a job in finance. He saw Lucas twice a year, awkward visits where he tried too hard, and Lucas remained polite but distant. Emma stopped hoping for more than that. She started dating cautiously. A kind man named Tom who worked as a teacher and had no interest in startups or get-rich schemes, who showed up when he said he would, and treated Lucas with genuine affection. I met Tom at a Sunday dinner and liked him immediately. His steadiness, his humor, the way he looked at Emma like she was the most interesting person in the room. Emma seemed happy, truly happy, in a way I hadn't seen since before she married Jeffrey. I asked her once if she regretted any of it, the marriage, the pain, the upheaval. She said no, because it gave her Lucas, and Lucas was worth every moment of struggle. I'm 73 now, older and slower, but still here, still showing up. I take Lucas to the park on Saturdays, push him on the swings, watch him climb and run and explore with the fearless confidence of a child who knows he's loved. He calls me Papa and tells me long, rambling stories about trucks and dinosaurs and whatever else captures his imagination. Emma brings him by for dinner twice a week, sometimes with Tom, sometimes just the two of them, and we sit around the table in the house that raised her and talk about ordinary things, work and school and weekend plans. The ordinariness is a gift. The peace is hard won. I've learned that love is not passive. It requires action, requires showing up even when doors close in your face, requires fighting through the lies and the barriers and the people who would separate you from those you care about. It requires the courage to investigate when something feels wrong, to trust your instincts, to refuse to accept a narrative that doesn't make sense. I've learned that sometimes the people we trust most will betray that trust, and the only response is to set boundaries, to protect yourself and the vulnerable ones who depend on you, and to build something new from the ashes of what was destroyed. I've learned that family is both a gift and a choice, that blood connects us but character sustains us, and that the strongest bonds are the ones we forge through crisis and rebuild with intention. Margaret used to say that life gives you what you need when you need it, though not always in the form you expect. I didn't expect any of this. The emergency call, the closed door, the forged signature, the dissolution of Emma's marriage, the unexpected joy of raising a grandson in the house where I raised his mother. But here we are, and I'm grateful for all of it, even the painful parts, because they led us here, to this moment, to this family, to this life that continues despite everything. Sometimes late at night I stand in the doorway of what used to be Emma's room and is now just a guest room, and I remember her as a child, her laughter echoing through these halls, Margaret's voice calling her down for dinner, the ordinary chaos of a life I thought would last forever. Those people are gone now, changed by time and loss and the inevitable forward motion of existence. But something of them remains, in Emma's strength, in Lucas's smile, in the way this house still feels like home despite all the ghosts. I turn off the light and walk down the hallway to my own room, and I sleep the sleep of a man who has fought for what matters and won, not completely, not perfectly, but enough. And in the morning Lucas will call asking if he can come over to help me water the garden, and I'll say yes, and life will continue, messy and beautiful, and exactly as it should be. If you've ever felt the door close between you and someone you love, if you've ever had to fight through lies to reach the truth, know that persistence matters, that showing up matters, that refusing to accept a false narrative can save the relationships that define your life.